Okay, I think we'll make a start. And for those that have just joined in the last minute, thank you for your patience. There was a technical issue in the background with invitations being sent out to join the meeting. You've obviously just received your email invitation link. So look, I'll start the webinar now, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Sim and Bernard Carlon in this presentation today. Before I do that and give you an overview of the webinar, I'll introduce myself. I'm Paul Durden. I am the co-chair of the New Zealand chapter of the College of Road Safety. Ping is a member on the committee with me in New Zealand, and Bernard is the chief at the Centre of Road Safety and Maritime Safety in New South Wales. And they're going to be presenting to you today on pedestrian safety on urban arterials, and they'll be talking about a study tour from the US Federal Highway Administration that identified or selected Australasia as part of a global benchmarking program to study the work that we've been delivering on pedestrian safety on urban arterials. So Ping will talk about what the work that's been happening in Auckland, New Zealand, and Bernard will be talking about the work that's been happening in New South Wales to improve pedestrian safety outcomes. I think overall it's a really great recognition globally of the work that has been happening in New Zealand and Australia to be selected for the study, and it's a fabulous opportunity for our representatives to be able to travel to the Transportation Research Board annual meeting in Washington D.C. earlier this year to share the study findings, and today is all about learning about that story that was shared. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Ping, who will present first. Thank you, Ping.
Kia ora, Paul. Tēnā
sorry.
koutou katoa. My name's Sim. I am a transport safety technical lead at Auckland Transport, and Bernard and I are really delighted to be able to share this story with you today. It's a great story for Australasia and what we do in pedestrian safety that we were selected for this study. And it's a great chance for us to reflect on how our work is seen through the eyes of international road safety colleagues. So that's part of what we've got for you today. So I'll just share this presentation I've got. I'd like to acknowledge the US Federal Highway Administration and the work that they did, and just thank them for bringing us to Washington D.C. at their cost. I'd also like to acknowledge a colleague, Jessica Rattray, the team leader at the New Zealand Transport Agency, who travelled alongside me. Jessica is unable to be with us today, so yeah, just want to acknowledge her work. So the story, and good stories always start with people, and this is very much the story of a team of US-based road safety professionals who came to Auckland and Sydney, chose us to look at the issue of pedestrian safety, particularly on urban arterials, and brought those learnings and those findings back to the US. Why did they decide to come here? In the way that they describe this, very much the data kind of spoke to them, and so they looked at how pedestrian fatalities are tracking in the US. There really is a pedestrian crisis at the moment there, and they compared that to how pedestrian fatality trends have been tracking in Australia and New Zealand in recent years. And so this compelling data was very much part of why Australasia was selected, and why they chose to kind of select us as the study topic for their global benchmarking program. I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the context of road safety and pedestrian safety in Auckland, and Bernard will do the same for New South Wales to give you that picture, and then I'll take you through some of the key findings of the study and our own lessons learned. So we are a large local road controlling authority in Auckland. We have a mixture of both urban and rural land area underneath Auckland Transport's jurisdiction. Our daytime kind of road deaths per 100,000 is 2.6. That is high when compared to other urban centres internationally. And more than half of our deaths and serious injuries involve people walking, cycling, or on two wheels. Bernard will show you a more long-term trend of how death and serious injury have tracked in New South Wales, and very much the New Zealand and Auckland picture shows the same, that if we zoom out to say the 70s, we do see a very long-term decrease in death and serious injury. This more close-up view just shows you that in more recent years in the New Zealand and Auckland picture, we did have a real spike in death and serious injury around 2017. It has gradually gone down since then, but there is still a lot of work to be done. What does a typical road death or serious injury in Auckland look like? For us, it's the afternoon on a weekday. That's the most common time we see a fatal serious injury crash. Our 50-kilometre-an-hour roads continue to hold the most harm, particularly urban arterials, and the majority of serious and fatal injuries occur in places where there has not necessarily been a history of fatal and serious crashes in recent years. More than half of death and serious injuries do involve people outside vehicles, particularly when we look at health data sets such as overnight hospitalizations, which can more fully represent that type of harm. We do see that particular people walking and people on two wheels play a large part in crashes in Auckland. When we look at who gets hurt and who is involved, if you have a look at the pedestrian line, that first row on this table, you can see that in the majority of cases where someone walking gets hurt in a two-party crash with a vehicle involved, another vehicle is most likely to be a car or some type of light motor vehicle. We don't see a lot of harm between, say, a pedestrian and a cyclist, or those types of modes. Over half of death and serious injury crashes in Auckland happen on roads with a posted speed limit of 50 kilometres an hour. The majority of our harm is urban and is on local roads, and 50 kilometre an hour speed limits continue to be locations that are common and produce a large amount of our harm. We understand more about the role of speed and speeding in serious crash trauma now, following this case study that was published in the Journal of Road Safety. And so 70% of injury crashes in New Zealand involve speeds that are above safe and appropriate speeds as a factor, and particularly for pedestrians, that risk of death increases exponentially as impact speeds increase. So what is working for pedestrian safety? And in particular, what did the US Federal Highway Administration study find? Interesting for us as professionals who live and breathe our work and practice every day, the study really looked upstream at some of the key tools that we have that for them they identified as being key to us to enable the delivery of effective pedestrian safety interventions. So one of their primary recommendations to the states, the various states in the US, was around movement in place. They used the term context in the states, and for them, the movement in place frameworks that they saw in Auckland and New South Wales, in New Zealand as a whole, were a key recommendation that they really thought underpinned the ability to deliver pedestrian priority and pedestrian safety interventions in high pedestrian environments. And so this graph, this diagram is how they have described the work that the Auckland Design Manual uses to talk about how, for say an urban arterial, the place or context function can change across that length. For example, if there were to be a town centre or an activity street in the middle. The US Department of Transport also looked at a tool in Auckland called Future Connect, which looks at the different mode priorities and puts them all together to come up with an overall modal prioritization at a network scale. This was something that they thought would be really, really helpful in their practice and help show the place of walking, so that a single road or street does not have to be all things to all modes. And there can be some roads and streets that are primarily places for walking and others that need to be designed for freight or other modes. And so that enables the delivery of interventions and infrastructure that supports the safety of those modes. And so putting all that together, this is an example of one of the Auckland mapping tools. So looking at movement in place together with that modal prioritization, and that creating the enabling framework for engineering treatments that will deliver on pedestrian safety. This is the New Zealand Transport Agency's One Network framework of movement in place. And around this, you can see examples of where speed limits have been changed and how they align with the movement in place framework. Speed management at a systemic and network scale was a key recommendation of this global benchmarking program study. And you can see here some of these civic spaces, local streets, activity streets, and main streets that have an important pedestrian function and can have speeds that are survivable for pedestrians. Some of the work that Auckland has done in this space is around the setting of safe and appropriate speeds. We've had a large safe speeds program over a number of years, and this is an example of some of the scale of that work that has happened over time. The work on speed limits has been supported by infrastructure. We did a demonstration project to raise 37 crossings to evaluate the effectiveness of increasing pedestrian safety by raising previous at-grade crossings. The evaluation of that showed that before those crossings were raised, there was serious and fatal crashes of around 2.4 a year. That decreased to 0.4 after the raising of those at-grade crossings, with 0 serious or fatal crashes for pedestrians. In addition, we have used a number of vertical devices, roundabouts, and other gateway treatments to help make roads make sense for people and to support speed limit changes with infrastructure and enforcement. The monitoring and evaluation of the Auckland Safe Speeds program shows that in roads in the first phase of the speed limit program, where speeds were lowered, deaths decreased by 30%. In comparison, where they weren't changed, deaths actually increased by 9% in other locations in the network when looking at the 24-month later data. So a difference of 39% between treated and untreated locations. The customer survey results also show that residents who have experienced town centre changes, which typically involved 30 kilometres an hour, together with infrastructure such as raised pedestrian crossings, have strongly supported that being rolled out into other parts of Auckland. One of the ways that the more high-level planning tools enables the actual delivery of pedestrian and safety infrastructure is through the Auckland Network Operating Plan. This plan uses level of service, which is quite common to be used for vehicle movements for all modes. And so when a project is being considered and the modal priority and the movement in place framework is is known and worked through, then the level of service for each mode can be worked through. And this is an example. That earlier photo you saw was of Quay Street at the Auckland waterfront, and that road has gone through a number of very, very major pedestrian improvements that have also lifted pedestrian safety. And part of what has enabled that is that underneath that, the Auckland Network operating plan shows that now the modal priority for pedestrians is high, and we are willing to accept a lower or medium level of service for vehicle movements due to the need to create key modal priorities. And so this is a great tool where I guess the rubber hits the road and actually allows the delivery of key interventions. I just wanted to share some of my own learnings from going to Washington D.C. and the experience on the Transportation Research Board. Here are some photos of just walking around the streets in Washington D.C. Raised crossworks are being trialled. In New Zealand at the moment, there's a lot of debate around raised devices, and one of my observations was that that debate is not unique to us. These interventions continue to be challenging, continue to need a lot of community conversation and quality engagement to be understood well. One thing I noticed, particularly because it was winter and there was a lot of darkness, is a lot of use of lights, of different treatments to try and highlight pedestrian crossings, the use of speed limits near schools. These are miles per hour, so kind of 25, or and also the speed limit sign on the bottom, really clear markings to show when speed limits are camera enforced, and that's a really great way to communicate when enforcement is happening. I put a cheeky photo of Paul Durden here, our co-chair, who was also at Transportation Research Board, and it was great. It was great to see the interest in tools like Mega Maps. If you're a New Zealander and you use that, some of the data that we have and we use, and sometimes I guess we take for granted, is really world leading, and a lot of interest internationally in our tools. So I'll just finish off with this video from Sherry Shaflin. She was the director of the global tour, and these are her words about how she found this contribution.
Hi, I'm Sherry Shaflin. I'm the Federal Highway Administration Director of the Office of Human Environment, and I'm based out of Washington, D.C. And I had the opportunity to be the career lead on our global benchmarking tour to New Zealand and Australia, and we've just it was really amazing to see all the great work that's been done, and the team, it was transformative for the team to see the cumulative benefit of doing all the above to influence having your fatality and serious injury numbers go down compared to ours that are going up. So what we really came back to the United States to tell folks was the safe systems, there's a way to operationalize the safe systems approach. And New Zealand and Australia have been doing additive things over the past several years and doing all the above, and it's making a big difference. And so we've just been thrilled to have Ping and Jess join us over here during the TRB, where they would have an opportunity to interact with 12,000 or 14,000 people to share the good story. So I want to thank everybody in New Zealand for sharing them with us this week, and we hope that we can really continue the exchange of information as we all continue to work on getting to zero.
So thank you to the Federal Highway Administration, and thank you to our Australasian colleagues. This is a great recognition of your work. Over to you, Bernard.
Just while Bernard's getting ready there, can I just remind everyone, if you've got any questions, please add them to the Q&A box. I can see that there's already a couple coming through, and I'll put those to the panelists following Bernard's presentation. And thanks for the great presentation there, Ping. That was awesome.
Great, thanks, Paul. Just hoping this pops up on screen for everybody shortly. And thank you, Ping, for inviting me to participate as well. Whilst I participated in the US visit, 70 increase in our fatalities last year, and was required to be here rather than travelling to Washington at the time. So, which is why you wouldn't have heard mention of New South Wales in the feedback from our colleagues in the United States. But I was able to do a pre-recorded presentation for the Washington Summit as well. So I'd like to initially start by recognising on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and recognise Indigenous people who are in this forum today as well, and really reflect on the fact that in New South Wales, Aboriginal people are twice as likely to be involved in a casualty crash, and that we recognise that we need to engage with community and actually turn that around, make a difference to the impact that road trauma is having in our Aboriginal people's communities across New South Wales. So just thought I'd present a little bit of context about New South Wales, which is the information we sort of provided, but been a little updated, because you can see in 2023, we had 351 fatalities, tragically 70 more than 2022. We have 25% of fatalities across Australia, 10,021 serious injuries in 2023, and that's matched data with our hospitals, which we publish on a quarterly basis, 6 months in arrears, and publicly make available through our website. 25% of those hospitalisations for serious injuries in terms of our contribution across the whole of Australia, and our annual financial cost of road crashes to the community is nearly $9 billion in New South Wales. Interesting to reflect on where we sit in the context of the OECD list, but this is a shortened version of that OECD list. And you can see that in 2022, New South Wales actually was sitting at around 11th in the OECD list. Tragically, with that increase in the fatalities in 2023, we slipped to 16th. But in 2022, we were actually the leading jurisdiction in Australia in terms of our rate of fatalities. And you can see here the impact of that significant increase that we've seen in fatalities in this last 18-month period, where we were actually tracking below our target for a reduction of 50% of our fatalities by 2030, and now we're significantly off track in meeting that target. That said, it's useful also to look at the context over time, and certainly in the late 1970s and 1980, we had 1,384 fatalities in 1978. And if we were to have that same rate of fatalities in New South Wales, last year would have been more than 2,200 deaths on our roads. And so, those significant policy and infrastructure and behavioural changes we've achieved over that last 40, 50-year period really do demonstrate that the journey towards zero is real, and that we need to continue to implement through our safe systems actions, integrated approaches to reduction of trauma. And so now reflecting on pedestrian fatalities and serious injuries in New South Wales, you can see that there's some fluctuation in terms of the proportion of the total fatalities between 14 to 20% since 2017. But you can see as well that the reduction that we've achieved as well, that from 54.69 back in 17-18, and then this continuous reduction that we've seen over recent years as a proportion. Interestingly, that when we look at the context for country, urban areas, metropolitan areas, you can see that significant reduction from 47 back in 2018. But we haven't seen a similar sort of response in our country urban areas, and those country urban areas actually did increase last year significantly. And so that's a focus for us as well, in terms of not just focusing on our larger cities, but also looking at those regional urban areas as well. And this just shows sort of the proportion of the total, which you saw earlier in the other graph. Try not to dwell too much on the same sort of issues that Ping's been able to outline as well. But you can see here, like, the significant issue we have in terms of our ageing population and the relative number of people over 70 who are affected as pedestrians in terms of fatalities in New South Wales. Which does focus our mind on, you know, where do we need to look at those populations where we have an ageing population cohort or across our urban areas in across the state, and actually look to the solutions for those older members of our community as well, who want to remain active and participate in being engaged and out in the community. How do we transform our local places to make that safe? And so when we look at the relative trauma load that actually comes from our higher speed, and this is reflected in as well, so the work that Ping has mentioned as well, you know, we can see that our 50 and 60 kilometre zones are contributing significantly to the fatalities that exist. And when we look at our serious injuries, and, you know, we're talking there in the 50 Ks, 2,963 over this time period, a significant burden in terms of trauma, and 1,685 in the 60 Ks. You know, it's, getting a placemaking framework working successfully is a really critical agenda for reducing that trauma. And as I said, we do have a significant and regular publishing of our serious injury data on our website, and this is just to exemplify the proportion of trauma that's actually reported by police in our system versus the total that's actually admitted to hospital in terms of pedestrian trauma in New South Wales, where there's no matched police report. And having that data and information is absolutely critical to sort of planning and decision making and understanding the scope and size of the trauma that's actually happening out there in our community as well. And when we start to look at where these crashes are happening as well by location, clearly non-intersection locations and intersection locations, there's a balance between those two environments in terms of the total. But when we do get to signalised intersections versus non-signalised, you can see that, you know, there's a much smaller proportion of that 50% which are actually happening at signalised intersections. And we do need to be thinking really carefully about the design of intersections where there is no treatment around signalised controls as well, because that's where the bulk of the burden is. In terms of strategic frameworks for long-term elimination of trauma, we've only recently, in the last 12 months, actually integrated into a new speed zoning standard in July, a movement in place framework around the way in which we're managing speed zoning and risk across New South Wales. And I think that, you know, this is, and we've done lots of great work over a long period of time, but actually getting these institutional frameworks right is absolutely critical for the future in terms of reduction of trauma. And certainly that is mixed and impact speeds and safe speed setting within particular urban environments across the state, which you'd all be very familiar with. And so I think, as Ping also said around Auckland, but, you know, internationally, when, you know, we look at movement in place frameworks, it's an absolutely critical aspect to the long-term elimination of pedestrian trauma in our places, and that placemaking function that we have really needs to critically understand the demographics of those local places, but design places that actually thrive, but also ensure that we're not, you know, we're eliminating the trauma for pedestrians in those locations. And similarly, this more detailed information around our movement in place framework, which is absolutely critical for a sustainability outcome, sort of connecting to those UN sustainability goals in which our trauma reduction framework in Australia is sort of driven through. And similar to Ping's network planning framework as well, this notion that we need to flip on its head the consideration of space allocation in prioritising pedestrians, people with disabilities, ahead of all of the vehicle movements in order to design places that actually eliminate trauma, but also make those places, the amenity of those places, the function of those places, drive safer outcomes. And we can see there's great practical examples of where that's being done in New South Wales, which we presented to the American Travel Group when they were here. And certainly, that sort of transformation of local places is absolutely critical to achieving those safety outcomes. I'll show you some of those in future slides. But, South Coast, actually this week, there was an announcement of a 30K sort of speed zoning change at a regional town, Cootamundra, where they're actually going from 50 to 30 in their town centre. It's also happening as well in places like Manly on the northern beaches. And so just quickly, the things that are working. So our red light speed camera program at those high risk locations, and you saw the proportion of the trauma there has been significantly reduced by the application of red light speed cameras, with a significant reduction in fatalities and pedestrian fatalities included in that. When we look at our pedestrian protection program, so we've actually treated around more than 500 two-phase intersections with a delay for the vehicles, so that pedestrians actually get priority advancement out onto the intersection. And in those 500 locations, we saw significant reductions from 43 to 47% reductions in fatal and serious injuries for pedestrians. And so, that's been a very effective treatment that's been applied across the network as well. And when we look at the long-term sort of application of our high pedestrian activity areas, they essentially, in our evaluation, detailed evaluation of those from 2002 to 15, eliminated pedestrian fatalities in those locations, which is, an outstanding result. But we need, now that we're moving towards this movement in place framework and more integrated use of 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometres an hour in those placemaking contexts, really critically important that we now do more to achieve those outcomes right across the whole of our urban places across the state. And I think one of the really critical and important things about it is essentially improving sort of the community's understanding and having in place education and communication, having a complete education process from detailed through all life stages, but also out in the community and reaching people continuously around education. We know that that has a really positive effect, not only in people's behaviour change, but also in relation to their acceptance of these sorts of changes that happen within their local environment as well, because they have a deeper and better understanding of the benefits. And that's it for me. Thanks, Ping.
Thank you, Bernard. That is great. And thank you, Ping, as well. I've made a few notes, and before I start going through some of the questions, I think my overwhelming theme that I'm picking up on here is that moving towards zero is entirely possible. We're presented with some great examples of work that's been delivered in Auckland and New South Wales that is really driving down road trauma, particularly for our most vulnerable road users. And it's a combination of raised crossings, roundabouts, and other vertical deflection devices, speed limits, red light speed cameras, pedestrian protection at signalised intersections, the high pedestrian activity areas, combining movement in place. All of these things working together are really helping deliver us some fantastic outcomes, and we need to keep doing more. I'll start asking a few of the questions that have popped up. And just a reminder to any attendees, if you do want to ask questions, please pop them in the Q&A section. So Ping, I think this one's probably meant for you. How did you manage to install so many 30km/h zones? Our local government representatives always use the excuse that 30 zones aren't in common use, so they won't support them. How do we push to support and install 30km/h speed zones?
Thank you. Wonderful question. Any conversation around speed limits, continues to be a challenge, and I think we're no exception in New Zealand. Things that we found really helped with the 30k conversation. One is being upfront and transparent about the data and evidence, particularly the difference for a pedestrian in surviving a crash at 30 and 50. That has been something that community members have said has been very, very compelling. Second, we have a lot of support for 30 kilometres an hour near schools. So the safety of children on the journey to school is a real priority for communities, for parents, for elected members. And so that has been a great place for us to start, the journey to school and the need to keep children safe on the journey to school. In addition, I would like to acknowledge some of the partners that have worked very closely alongside us, such as our health partners, who have really talked to the health evidence and how important it is for children to get active, to be walking, to be out and about, and the need for safe environments to enable healthy ways of travel. So there have been three things that have really helped us on our journey.
Wonderful, thank you. With another question, Ping, and I may be presuming here, but it's a comment that's made around an arterial which has a port at one end. So it may well be in the Auckland context, because we have the Port of Auckland right in at the end of downtown area. Are there any success stories when we've got a mix of, I guess, high levels of freight activity in an urban area and pedestrian safety? Are there some success stories that we could point to, and what types of treatments worked well in that environment?
No, thank you. And yes, so the waterfront in Auckland contains the port. It is a strategic cycling route with a protected separated cycle lane. It is obviously a high pedestrian priority area. The connection to the sea from the main transport hub and across the road to the ferry terminal sits across this road. So things that have really helped the transformation of that road, which used to be have kind of 2 to 3 lanes of vehicles on either side, and now they've cut back the number of vehicle lanes, they've increased the pedestrian space, have been particularly that the network operating plan that I spoke of. So it's very clear now that the level of service for kind of regular vehicle traffic is not as high as it is for freight, for cycling and for walking. And so it's a road or street cannot be everything to everyone. And so by really focusing on the priorities, there's been some really good work, particularly done with signals and lights. So if if a heavy vehicle is waiting, particularly waiting to turn in and out, we prioritize that movement. We need to assure our freight sector that they can enter and exit the port as they need to. When there is not a freight vehicle triggering that light, then, for example, we will give a lot of signal priority to pedestrians and cyclists. So we also get a really, really good movement of people walking and cycling at the same time as creating a kind of safe entry and exit for freight.
Thank you, Ping. Bernard, feel free if you've got contributions to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think, look, the other issue that's been clear around Auckland's progress and ours is having those institutional frameworks in place, so that you actually are, and I think that's where our American colleagues were really sort of impressed with the outcomes that are being achieved. Like, if we start with having those network parameters actually embedded in the way in which we're actually operating the network, in that great example that Ping just mentioned as well, then using those systemic changes over time is what's going to continue to drive down the trauma and provide more access and efficiency across the network as well. Like we can do.
Yeah, sorry, if I can just build on that, because there is another question related to what you've just said there, Bernard. So what's been the approach to embedding and supporting the uptake and application of institutional frameworks across all of the transport network planning, design and implementation?
I think for our example, like we have a really progressive transport planning, a strategic planning area with a future transport strategy out till 2050. And so, working really closely in an integrated way with them, and as well, I think in terms of the aspirations for achieving more active transport. My beginning of my career, I worked in health promotion, and I think that's a critical partnership for us in terms of achieving those long-term strategic outcomes of rebalancing active transport as a mode of transport, but doing it in a way that is integrated into the design of the system, so that we're also ensuring that it doesn't lead to additional trauma. And when we look at some other jurisdictions internationally, I have colleagues in the Netherlands who, there were, I think, 300 bicycle rider fatalities last year, and they're lamenting the fact that they didn't put in place those institutional frameworks like mandatory helmet wearing and those sorts of aspects of safety, because now that they have done the transition, they're finding that the trauma is actually increasing. And so it's really important to have the whole of the integrated systems approach happening at the same time, so that whilst we're growing active transport, we're also not growing the trauma outcomes associated with that.
Brilliant. Look, I think that's a really important message to deliver here, in that we can't just solve the road trauma problem in silos, just through infrastructure, just through speed, just through laws and legislation. It all needs to work together across all aspects of the safe system principles. Ping, there's a couple of comments that have come through around roundabouts, and so maybe one of the photos that you put up may have generated some feedback on this, so bear with me. So roundabouts, did the treatment include raising the profile of the roundabout intersection as a whole, or was it just raised platforms on the approach or departure lanes? And a follow-up to that, a question asked, why don't you have pedestrian crossings at all the access and exit points on roundabouts?
Thank you. Lovely questions. So we do a variety of mixtures of both vertical and horizontal deflection. So sometimes we do raise a whole intersection, and sometimes we use vertical deflection on the approaches, such as raised pedestrian crossings or raised tables. I'm aware that I showed a single photo, and that didn't comprehensively cover the range of treatments that we have. But no, absolutely, sometimes we do raise whole signalized intersections, whole non-signalized intersections, and other times we raise approaches. So depends a lot, I guess, on the specifics of the location and the needs.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just mindful of time, but we'll, if people wish to, please stay around. We'll go a couple of minutes longer. One for both of you. Are you aware of any agency around the world that considers slips, trips and falls on both roads and footpaths, because they don't necessarily get captured in a road safety crash database if it's simply a pedestrian falling over on a footpath or tripping on some road infrastructure and injuring themselves?
I can talk to that one. So we've done a lot of research on hospitalization data, which picks up single party pedestrian harm. It is a huge area, particularly in Auckland for older people, serious injuries, sometimes fatalities, particularly associated with tripping, either tripping on a kind of a trip lip or an issue with the footpath surface, or between the carriageway and the footpath itself. In New Zealand, the definition of a crash to go into the crash analysis system that we use nationally needs to include either a motor vehicle or a bicycle. So they exclude those types of crashes on point of entry. Personally, I do think that there's opportunity to be more holistic, given we consider single party vehicle crashes in the same way. But yeah, I do acknowledge that internationally it's not something widely accepted in road safety agencies.
Yeah, I think Ping just to reinforce that, yes, the definitions tend to be, exclude individual pedestrian where there's no vehicle involved from a road safety perspective. Interestingly, that also goes out to sort of self-harm and a whole range of medical episodes, which I think we should also, as road safety professionals, be thinking about what are the preventative things that we can do within the system for all of those trauma outcomes. So actually having a really good quality data and information systems for all of those aspects, I think is a really important future sort of aspiration that we should aim for as well, because we want to try to reduce all harm, not just necessarily where there's a specific vehicle in a crash. And I think in those other areas of self-harm and medical episodes, we have systems in place for driver licensing and registration to try and manage those risks. We should be really looking at that data and trying to design, say, systems approaches to the reduction of that as well.
Thank you. We'll take. I'll put one final question to you, then we'll call the webinar to a close. So, in terms of more of your town centre and CBD areas, is there any increasing use of scramble crossings or barns dance crossings where all pedestrians cross all directions all at once? And what advantages do you see of that versus potentially downsides of that type of treatment?
No, thank you. And so I didn't actually know the term scramble crossings, but we tend to use the term barns dance. So you push the button once and you can cross diagonally if you prefer. So that is a standard treatment in the city centre in Auckland and also in kind of town centres. And again, it relates to that priority for pedestrians. So if the movement in place framework and the network operating plan indicates the need to provide that high level of service with pedestrians, it's obviously a much better customer experience. You don't need to wait twice. You get to go exactly where you want. It can be integrated with kind of green wave phasing for pedestrians. So just a really nice long cycle for pedestrians. No need to wait. Get to where you want straight away. So that that's something that we use commonly as a pedestrian priority measure.
And Paul, I think other jurisdictions and cities like Sydney can learn some things from Auckland. We can all, I think, learn from each other where we can see those sorts of applications. We only have a very few. We call them scrambled over here. Things. So actually, I went through one this morning coming down here to the minister's office where there is one right out in front of St James Station, which is really convenient and does sort of I think give pedestrians a much greater sense of safety as well in that environment.
Okay. Thank you, Ping, and thank you, Bernard, for the time that you've dedicated today and for presenting on the findings of the study tour and the work that's happening in New South Wales and Auckland. Apologies if I didn't get around to answering your questions today. Please be aware that the webinar has been recorded. So once that's been tidied up, that will go up onto the Australasian College of Road Safety's website, and you'll be able to view it and share it with your colleagues who may not have attended the presentation today. But once again, thank you, Ping, thank you, Bernard, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you all for participating.
Cheers. Thank you.